Welcome to this episode of the Biometrics Leadership Lab Live. We are here to support you on your biometrics journey, giving you tools and knowledge you need to grow from lead to leader. And today we are talking about queries. I'm very excited to have guests representing multiple points of view, CRA, data management, and the site. Thank you for joining us live. And if you're watching a replay, thank you for taking the time to catch up. You can ask questions on the event notice on LinkedIn and we will see them. However, we can't respond in writing while live. So if we don't get to your question, it'll get answered after the event, either in the comments or in an upcoming edition of our newsletter. Before we get started, we're going to do some introductions. I am Amanda Cross, founder of Crossfield Coaching and Consulting, a biometrics and clinical data advisory, helping small and mid-sized companies and teams manage data risk, integration, oversight, and governance. With decades of experience in clinical research, from statistician to COO, I leverage my cross-functional experience and training to help teams integrate, communicate, and collaborate in order to improve data integrity. And now to our panelists. Deb, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Deb Cole. I'm the Associate Director for Data Management at AskBio. Sorry there. I have 30 years of experience in the industry doing both pharma and CROs, and I'm just very, very passionate about what I do as a data manager and working with the sites and the CRAs to complete a study.
Andrea?
Hi, my name is Andrea Durham. I am the founder and owner of the Durham Research Collaborative and Durham Research Strategies. And I have 18 years of experience in the industry. I'm currently a consultant. I have worked at the site level, the sponsor level, and the CRO level, and primarily as a clinical research associate, as well as a clinical research CTL, clinical trial lead. So.
Great, thank you. And Danielle?
Hi, I'm Danielle Brown. I am working at the site as a senior clinical research coordinator. My areas of expertise is anything from CNS to vaccines, sickle cell, things of that ilk, cardiology, and I am excited to be here.
Great. Thank you guys for taking some time to join me today. I want to just talk about queries in the most general sense in terms of what is the real purpose of a query from your perspective? And I'm going to start with Andrea.
Sure. So the real purpose in my eyes of a query is to resolve a discrepancy. Maybe if there's a mismatch in the system, if there's an outlier, to confirm that outlier is a true outlier, or if it's just a typo. So to get clarification, get confirmation of data.
And I agree with that we do have queries to clarify information, and in that process, it can open up discussions that we probably didn't know that we needed to have between the CRA and the site.
Deb, what do you think?
I think the purpose of a query is to, much like Andrea said, to clarify discrepancies in the data, also to ensure that the primary and secondary endpoints of the trial are being collected in the same manner across the board, across all of the sites and data points that we have. So to just ensure for the biometrics team, the BIOS team, that the data is consistent, because we do get those queries coming from them that, are looking at inconsistencies in pieces of data. So I think it's across the board, just preparing to submit to the FDA, make sure that the data is of the quality that needs to be there.
Yeah, I have in my mind certain buckets of everybody's role in around the data. Data is to make sure the data is correct and consistent, right? Is it consistent in and among itself from all of its sources, and is it correct in terms of what actually happened to that patient? I always say programming is it accurately represented on the TFL? And stats is it analyzed correctly and consistently? And then medical writing, did they tell the story correctly? But I think that data management perspective of complete and consistent is really key. So I called this one else clarify because there's a lot of humor, I think, around the industry in terms of really confusing queries. Confirm this, if not, do this. Otherwise, explain it, else clarify. So, one, Danielle, have you ever seen a query like that? How do they end up like this?
So from a data management perspective, the queries end up like that because data management can't be directive to the site. We don't have the source in front of us. So we can't say something like, this height doesn't match the source. So we have to write very vague type of queries. And we try to put in there as much as possible. But we want the site to tell us, hey, if this really is the value, tell us why. Because then we can explain it to the next person down the line. And the queries become part of the audit trail and are sent to the FDA. So having that information, I think, data management queries are vague on purpose. We can't lead the site to the answer we think they should put there.
Danielle, how do you approach it when you get a query that's got seemingly multiple options?
So with Deb agreeing, I think that's where it really comes at a point being confident in your skills as a coordinator, because sometimes it's not data that is incorrect. It is data that actually did happen, and you just kind of have to be able to speak to that and have that conversation, because that audit trail is really going to show kind of that clarification and that discussion, and it should tell a story pretty much is what I'm trying to get at.
Andrea, what about kind of navigating that communication? Like, do you hear from sites like, what the heck's going on with this? What do I do? And how directive can you be with it?
So I try not to use the else clarify format. As a CRA, I'm usually right there in front of the source data. And so I can see what has been written down in real time versus what's been entered in EDC, maybe a few days, maybe even a week after that visit has happened. But I also try to write in a way that I can close it remotely. So once, the site confirms, yes, this was an error, or no, the answer is, the answer is that's entered in EDC is correct, then I may not verify that data point. I might close the query, but I'm going to wait till I get back on site to make sure that this also has been updated in source. So that's how I approach it. But then I also really agree with Deb and Danielle that it's so important that, that audit trail for that clarification is there and present. So we're not going around and around in circles when the next person comes on board and it's like, well, why was it done this way? Well, this is why it was done this way. So that audit trail is so important.
What's a good query look like? Like, Danielle, if you're receiving a query and it's a good query.
A good query is clear and actionable, just because there are multiple studies going on at the site level. So if we're looking at outstanding queries, we want to get those closed as soon as possible. And if I can clearly look at a query and see what you're asking of me, then that's something that I can immediately close out, and it won't have to be outstanding for many days to come. Something that is going to tell me, well, and I know data management can't do this, but from CRA, CRC perspective, just that collaboration to kind of see how, I'm trying to find my words, what is the discussion that's being said? Because data management, like Deb said, is going to be more vague. So from a CRA, I'm expecting something to be very actionable. What are you asking for me to do so that I can do it? And if not, then that's fine too. We just need to have a further discussion to see what needs to be finalized to get it done.
Deb, what do you think when you're writing queries? How do you structure it so that you think, yes, this is a good, clear query for the site? They're going to know exactly what to do.
I started from the standpoint of give them the value that is in question, so that, like, there are times that you may not have a specific field that you need to put something on because something's missing. So you put it in a place where the site doesn't understand why they're getting queried on it. And those are not good queries. So maybe that's a not good example, but you want to be on the field that has the value that's in question. And you want to, without leading, kind of lead them to what you're looking at. So an example that I can use is I had a study where we were collecting height and weight, and it appeared that the unit for the weight was incorrect because they said the patient was 350 kilograms, which is pretty big. And perhaps it was really pounds that they were looking for. And all the other visits had been in pounds. So we queried to confirm that 350 kilograms is correct. And I thought that was very clear. Like, look at the two pieces together, kilograms, 350, and it should be. We ended up having to go around a couple of times and finally get the CRA involved to say, can you please look at the source document the next time you're out there and see if it's pounds or kilograms, because it's inconsistent with the previous visits. And the site had already said, yep, this is what we did. It was kilograms. Something's wrong. And so to me, it seems like when we write the queries, as long as you focus on what is the discrepant data, it should be clear. But working with my sites, working with my CRAs, it's not always clear because they're looking at something else. They're thinking it's something else. So I like to keep the communication pathway open. I can't have a direct conversation with Danielle if she was on my study, but I can have a direct conversation with Andrea, and I can write in an email to Andrea, this is the problem that we're seeing. Can you talk to the site, because you can be more directive as a CRA. And I think that, to me, is, if I think now, as I've grown in my experience, something is going to be unclear to the site, I will go to the CRA immediately with the query that I'm writing, and say, this is coming to your site, please help them. This is what we're looking for. I don't know if anybody else does that or has that experience, but that's what I like to do.
What do you do? How do you handle that, Andrea?
No, I agree. I think if there's been a lot of back and forth and still no solution to an issue, then it's time for, I would say, a CRA to sit down, preferably face to face, with the site coordinator to work through what exactly is expecting, what are they asking for, what is data management not understanding, or where the disconnect is, to resolve that issue. But of course, if it's been outstanding for a while, I would expect as a CRA to have already stepped in to try to get that resolved. We don't want queries, hanging and aging, because with any project, site staff start to transition. The coordinator could leave, the CRA could leave, data management could transition. So it's ideal to get things resolved as quickly as possible, with as little back and forth as possible.
And you want to stay close to the patient visit, right? Because maybe there's something that the coordinator will remember, but when it's 3 months later, they're not going to have that clarity. But there's two really practical questions I want to ask. How many back and forth are too many back and forths before you should be getting the CRA involved? So let's start there, because I already forgot the second question, but how much is too much back and forth?
I would say, as a coordinator, I'm not responding to a query more than maybe 2 or 3 times. depending on the response that I get back from the data team, before I escalate it to the CRA, just because, again, when you're having that communication over like typed words, things can really get misconstrued, or you won't kind of explain yourself as needed. So the CRA does like act as that bridge to fill in that gap, to provide that clarification for both data management or the site.
I would agree. I'd say no more than twice.
And I was going to say twice too, and I don't know. We escalate to the CRA after 2 times. Sometimes we'll write a third one just because the CRA comes back and says, I'm going there next week. Just go ahead and open the query. But 2 times, we don't want to get anybody caught in a loop of this spiral of can't get the answer. Everybody's getting frustrated. So.
Yeah, and that's really similar to advice I give like on emails, right? If you have 3 emails about the same question and it's not answered, it's too many. You have to have some actual words exchanged. So whose responsibility is it to notice that the query is going back and forth and bubble it up to the CRA?
I would say that's actually on the coordinator's part. So you should be able to have, knowing what you know about the query and seeing how the trajectory is going with you in data management, you should absolutely be the one to initiate that pause. And on my side, we actually have our own like data entry team. So sometimes I'll tell them to hold off on a response. The monitor's coming in a week or so, and then we'll just have that discussion in person, and then we'll resolve it like that.
And I think it's a shared one because data management sees across all of the sites. So we may see the same issue bubbling up at different sites. And so if we're on the second round of query for that issue and we are not getting responses, we're going to bubble it up right then to the CRA. And we actually have an issues log that we can send to the CRAs on a weekly basis, or less frequently, more frequently, depends on where your study is, where we can say, these are the ones that, we've queried twice. We're still not getting a response. Can you, the CRA, handle that the next time you're out there?
Yeah. I would agree that it's on everybody's. It's a shared responsibility. So as a CRA, I should be sending my sites regular updates of what queries are in the system. And then also I could see, okay, these are aging. Industry standard is usually, queries are to be resolved within 5 business days. And depending on if we're close to a database lock, then of course 3 days, 24 hours. So everybody has to keep their thumb on the query load and just what's outstanding at the site from every single angle.
So that was actually my second question, which was how old is too old? And so 6 days apparently, is generally getting old, and you want to avoid. Here's where it gets tricky, right? Because everybody kind of says it's a shared responsibility. And so if nobody picks that up, how does that get carried forward? And I think it's really.
I don't think that it doesn't get picked up. I think data management has the onus for providing the reports to the team to see the high level. I think in all of my studies, the CRAs have access to run their reports, but we still provide at least once a week a report. And then we talk about it in the team meetings. What are those queries that are aging out longer than they should? So, 5 to 10 days for a regular query, less time if you're at a lock or it's a query coming out of safety or PV where there are reporting timelines to the FDA. We're going to, be watching those and sharing those out on a regular basis, but still have the expectation that someone like the CRA or the clinical trial manager should be able to run those reports anytime they need to.
So,
go ahead. Sorry.
So I know it's not. The answer to this next question is not the site. So Danielle, you're off the hook. Who is responsible for trends across the site? So, because Deb, you had mentioned, if you see this query is coming up at multiple sites, right? And multiple sites may have different CRAs. So how is clinical getting that coordinated look at issues?
Now, see, I think that's a little bit of a tougher question there, because as an example, we have a field that I've had a field in a study where nearly every site got the response wrong. So is that a site issue, or is that something wrong with the CCGs or how we've implemented it? When you have more of the sites having the same issue with the same field, it's an implementation issue. So data management has to take a look at that. We have to look and say, do we need some different wording on the field label? Because field labels are usually a little bit easier to change than the actual field. Do we need some more training for the sites in the CCGs? We didn't call it out enough. We need to talk to the CRAs about it. But at the same time, so we're looking at that. We are getting comments back as we sit in the meetings with the CRAs, because my team has meetings with the CRAs on a regular basis. And we're listening to the CRAs. What are the sites struggling with? So maybe there's fields that they're not even entering yet because they're confused what they're supposed to put in there. So Andrea, I don't know what your experience is, but I'm happy to have as many meetings. That sounds strange. I'm happy to have as many meetings as possible to make sure the data is coming in cleaner and faster in the end. So do the work up front, get those things in place. But I do think, Amanda, to your point, it is data management's responsibility to start looking at the trends from the very, very beginning of the study, because the monitors may not go out for 6 weeks.
Yeah, I agree. It's very rare that in a project or a study that you get everything right the first time around, right? So that is what's being resolved every time we have an update to the CCGs or the protocol. Literally, that is what we're doing, is we're offering some clarification on some points that have maybe, contributed to some slowdown, some misunderstanding. And so that's literally what is happening. And so I agree, from the outstart of, a project, a clinical trial, that is what we're doing, is clarifying through those updated reference documents. So your protocol, your CCGs, your pharmacy manual, and so on.
Okay, so we kind of landed on it's the lead data manager's responsibility for somebody in data management who's managing queries to have a feel for overall query trends, whether it's on fields or whatever, and bubble that up. We're going to talk about the types of queries that frustrate you the most from your viewpoint. Site goes first. What are the types of queries that bug you the most?
Honestly, system queries, it's very vague, but system queries, if they're done right, are very helpful in catching very obvious, very big, like deviations or other protocol discrepancies. But if they're wrong, you get a bunch of queries opened for no reason. And again, as a coordinator who has a separate data entry team, they're often coming over to me, asking me to like double check with the protocol or recount my dates, knowing that my dates are correct if the auto query is that I'm out of window by 1 day. And that's a very scary thing to see on a randomization visit. So it's just certain things like that where it's programmed incorrectly that just kind of lets the site do a lot of double checking and reevaluation on data that's already correct.
Andrea, what ones frustrate you the most?
That's a really good one, the system queries, but I would have to say vendor queries, just because that is an opportunity for the ball to be dropped, because the CRA doesn't, have oversight of those vendors. And then also the site, if we're sending that query report to the site, then they're panicked, especially if those vendor queries have been outstanding for a long time. It could really create a hiccup in what we're trying to accomplish. So just with the vendor queries, just making sure a proper communication pathway and management pathway has been established, like who's taking responsibility of following up with them on a regular basis, not when we're up against a timeline or a deadline. So that would be something that frustrates me.
Deb?
So for me, the queries that are the most frustrating are those queries that I think should have never been asked for by the rest of the team to be programmed. So most of my more recent studies for screen failures, we only require 5 forms to be completed for screen failures. So queries on forms that aren't those 5 forms, I think are frustrating because we're asking the site to potentially put in data, but it's not going to be SDV'd by the CRA. It's not going to be used in analysis. They're system queries, to Danielle's point. So those are the ones that I think are the most frustrating. Like please help me understand the value for those queries. And it's a continued conversation with the medical team and the bios team, which aren't represented here, who are asking for those queries to be programmed because they want this information. And they're thinking of the randomized patients, not those screen failure patients that might have some of that data entered.
I'm going to pop back to query aging because we actually had a comment where somebody said, everyone said 5 days was the target, but almost every site averages more than 5 days. So is 5 days the target if no one's going to escalate for 30 days, 60 days?
It should, in an EDC system where you're able to get in and out of it on a regular basis, I think having a timeline that is closer to the visit is something that we should be working towards. And I recognize the sites have lots of studies that they're working on, but most of these queries in these EDC systems pop the minute you come off that page, the minute you click that submit button and go to the next one. So it's not like you're waiting for a bolus of queries to be faxed into you at the site. The queries are sitting there. That exception, of course, is those queries that are coming from reviews that are done outside of EDC. But for those queries, I struggle understanding the site perspective on, I just submitted that page and query popped on it, but I didn't go back and answer it. So I'm not even going to go there. Danielle, can you help me understand what that data flow looks like?
I can. So sometimes, and it's going to be different based on the site because I know some sites don't have a data entry team, but if they are only focused on entry, then it's just going to be entry and they're going to want to get that entered and then deal with the queries afterwards just to kind of break up work since they do have to balance other studies. And then again, they're not the coordinators on these trials. So if they see a query, odds are they probably are going to need some guidance or at least some confirmation on how to respond to it. And then the coordinator is not always available to then meet with the data entry team for resolution. But also I'll say that this plays a part in why entering data on the site's end in those 1 to 3 business days of the visit happening is also important because if the data is entered in late, then the queries, it might be reviewed same day or something, but it's still going to be ways away from the visit.
Yeah. Thank you. Because I've always wondered what that looked like at this site. So thanks for helping me out.
I'm going to go get a data entry job at the site and see what it's like. I always say when I retire, I'm going to go to the site and see what you can do. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about 2 times the query timing can be a bit frustrating. The first is getting queries months, or even years after a visit. Why is that happening, Andrea and Deb? And then, how do you manage that at a site? Because if it's years later, you probably weren't even on that study. So let's start with why it's happening.
Well, I will say why that's happening is that data cleaning happens in waves, and it also happens in different perspectives. So, as we get ready for a data cut or a database lock, even more resources are, contributed to or dedicated to this data cleaning, and things are found later, much later, months later, years later. And I know that it is frustrating. And I think, sites may perceive, well, you've been coming to the site to monitor, or, we've did this review last year. Why is this query coming up now? I was like, well, we're looking at it from different perspectives. and we found different trends. So now that's brought up different questions. And now maybe it requires remonitoring or re-review. So that's why those queries pop up months, maybe years later.
And then I just want to clarify maybe Andrea, I'm taking words out of your mouth, but data cleaning is not just data management. So what happens, at least from my experience, is when BIOS is doing the dry run, so they've programmed all the tables, listings, and figures, and they're looking at that, very oftentimes that comes at the end of the study. And so when you see data presented differently than just looking at a CRF, you may see something in the data that now needs to be queried. So that review oftentimes will trigger a lot out. But then the other thing that's happening is new eyes look at data in a new way. So if you get a new medical person on the study, that medical person is responsible for a lot of things, including, part of the writing of the CSR. So they're going to review the entire patient, and they're going to see something that maybe the previous medic knew about but didn't document somewhere. And so now they're going to question it. And it is very frustrating. I've been on a study that ran for 8 years, and we were going back querying stuff from the beginning because we had new people come on, and then the BIOS dry runs were being done, and they just saw things in the data. And I'm just going to speak from data management. It's not us. It's not us. We're doing our data cleaning on almost every single day. The cycle might be once a month, that we do it, but we're doing it, and we're trying to clean the data in a timely fashion because we don't want that bolus of cleaning at the end. We don't want that bolus of queries going out to the sites at the very end either. But there are other people, like Andrea said, other eyes on the data at that point as you're coming towards the end of a study.
All right, so you're at the site, you pop open that EDC and you see a query from a patient visit 3 years ago. What are you doing after you stop laughing and crying?
You're on mute.
Sorry, I said I would be both laughing and crying. But I would grab the source binder and try my best to kind of go through it. And like you said, odds are it's not a study that I was the coordinator of at that point. So what I'm really focused on are those major data points, or even reading the progress notes, because I'm looking for any clues that a previous coordinator might have left in those progress notes to kind of provide that additional information that might not have had an actual data point in EDC. But if I can find clarification from the progress note, then odds are that's going to be the answer they're looking for, which is why it's really important as a coordinator. Anytime I document, my goal is anyone from a year or two from now should be able to look at my books and completely understand what happened, what didn't happen, and why it didn't happen.
What do you do when you can't find the answer?
When I can't find the answer, I would escalate to the CRA. They probably do have other ways to brainstorm to see where we could find. Or sometimes if it's something that we generally can't resolve, then that's another discussion that we would have to have.
But that then, and Amanda, is the original value is correct. There's no other information. This matches the source. It is what it is. Right. BIOS or the medic might think it looks odd, but that's what's there. We don't have anything else.
Correct. Yeah.
We're accepting it as correct. Yes.
Yep. Okay. So the other issue of timing. Oh, before I go to the other issue of timing, I just want to say, Deb, you said something which I would shout from the rooftops 24/7 if I could, which is data cleaning is not all data management. So I just think it's not all of their responsibility, and data management does more than just data cleaning, which I've talked about in the past. So I just want to clarify, they're not hanging out in their cubes trying to come up with the most frustrating queries.
Oh, no, that's not our job. I think I haven't said that yet, but data management, it's our favorite thing is not to write queries,
So the other time that queries become a timing issue is right before database lock. And so I think you alluded to that earlier, which is, if there hasn't been any analysis at all through a study and ahead of database lock, the stats team is finally doing a dry run.
Yeah.
They're going to find issues.
Oh my God. I had a study where the BIOS person 2 days before lock finished up their programming of the tables, listings, and figures and their review of it and sent me 600 queries to issue out to the sites 2 days before database lock.
What did you do?
I escalated that one because that one is, we've already gotten PI signatures because we were told everything was done, but also because we have to have a conversation with the clinical trial manager and the CRAs that these queries are going to come out. Plus, we also then need to also look at maybe some of those queries aren't critical. Maybe they're on data that supports a primary endpoint, but is not the primary endpoint. So maybe we don't need to issue out 600 queries. Can we have an internal team discussion and bring all the parties in? And obviously 600 queries 2 days before a database lock is likely you're going to miss your database lock too. So that has to be escalated up. Yeah.
In that one, without giving anything too much away, but in that one, what was the resolution? Did you cut back on queries? Did you delay lock?
We delayed lock. Yeah.
And I think that it's everybody works as best as they can, as quickly as they can, when they can. Just say that so nobody sends me any hate mail. But this is the danger of leaving statistical programming too late in the game, because then you do come up with these. Okay, so Danielle, you're at the site. You hopefully know database lock is pending because Andrea has called you 2 weeks ahead of time or 2 months ahead of time and given you the date and has kept you updated. But the day before your PI is due to sign, you get 300 queries. What are you doing?
I am first contacting my monitor, my CRA, and then, well, they would be in the loop, but just letting them know, hey, from a site perspective, this may or may not be feasible. But, we will work on it as best that we can and seeing if we can do any more formal collaboration and getting it as much resolved before the due date.
Andrea, how do you help your sites be prepared for lock?
I would say either send an email, make a phone call. I try to avoid a site getting blindsided, and that's really the only thing you can do. But to what Deb said, you escalate and you all come to a decision as a team. I don't think there should ever be any unilateral decisions made. This is a team effort. A lot of different people are playing into this, and a lot of different people have to be on board with how to move forward, because the answer isn't always clear cut. Where in her instance they extended the timeline for the database lock. Others may pare down the number and the type of queries issued. You have to come to a consensus of what is the best way to move forward. So
there's a couple of threads from this conversation that I underscore. One is if stats is programming really late and really up against the database lockdown, they shouldn't be doing it in a bubble so that nobody knows about, right? So the broader team should know, data management should know, the project manager should know. So it's hopefully been conveyed to sites that we're not going to finish programming. We may have queries. Can we prepare so that, knowledge is power. So if people know that's going to happen, that they can prepare for that. So that's one thing that can help mitigate that. The second other thing that can come up, which they're not represented here either, but make sure that your medical writing team is involved in the dry run review or has some view into the data for database lock, because they find things that other people don't because they're writing those patients, right? So they've got to tell the story for certain patients and certain outliers, and so they might have their own questions. So the more people who have seen it well before lock, the better. And then the other point to note is that database lock is not a data management thing. That's after I finish saying data cleaning is not data management. I'll also say database lock is not only data management, because there's so many moving parts in it You've got the site, you've got other teams, you have third-party data vendors who, that typically, or, a data manager might not have oversight of a third-party vendor, depending on how contracts and reporting lines are set up. And so everybody needs to be clear on what's happening and what the timeline is. And I think the third-party data is another reason for last-minute queries ahead of database lock, because depending on how they're being resolved or how well they are being handled and when the penultimate transfer is made to do, that second to last reconciliation, can all impact last-minute queries. We have talked about this quite a bit on and off throughout the whole conversation, which is the CRAs in the middle. So what are your best tips, Andrea, for data management and sites to kind of help navigate queries a little bit more cleanly based on what you've seen?
Well, one of the key things is that the sites and the CRAs need to review the CCGs, the completion guidelines. Make sure you're doing the training, documenting. If something comes up, make sure you're referring back to those completion guidelines so that you know how to resolve the query correctly the first time around. And then, it's just something that can't really be, it's not something that can be avoided 100%. So just take it in stride, make sure, as soon as you hit a roadblock or some resistance or some misunderstanding, then you're going to the source, whether it is, data management, whether it is, something that's already been discussed in a team meeting, just making sure that you understand what is expected. And then you go back to your site to get that query resolved as quickly as possible.
Like so many conversations, it all comes back to communication. We talked a little bit about this when we were in our prep session, which is way back in the day. Some of us, I think Danielle's too young for this, but queries used to be handled on paper, right? These report forms are collected on paper. Queries would be collected on data clarification forms, DCFs, and they would be mailed and FedExed and faxed to and from site. And it was an extra effort to manage on paper. And so I think it was more likely to generate a conversation sooner than later. Like if the site was handling less queries, they might talk to the CRA or to data management and say, I just want to make sure I understand this so I get it right and we're not sending this paper back 6 times. So I think you can lose that thread of communication with the system in between, I think sometimes, because you're electronic instead of paper.
I think too, one of the other things that can really help, and I think Danielle spoke about it when we were prepping, was if we can involve the site, maybe you're going to get to this question, like when we're building the database so that they can see the flow of the CRFs, see the queries that may pop out, and even having the CRAs in there. I know we talked about some of the limitations around that, but having those types of reviews during the startup of the study is also, I think, really important way that we could keep the CRAs from always ending up in the middle, because we could make some tweaks early on in database build or maybe right after we go live. Usually we don't have a patient at that point, but we could make the changes and get things tweaked so that the sites would better understand the queries.
Danielle, have you ever had a request to review an EDC early?
I have not, but I would love to be open, because if we collect the EDC, we can make sure our source has the exact same data points, and the flow of source is going to be the flow of EDC. Sounds good to me.
So anybody who's listening who can control that, I think, it is a little bit, we talked about it in part because part of E6R3, which is, stakeholders having say in what systems are going on and what they look like. It is an operational challenge because the site may or may not be willing to participate ahead of contracting, and depends on when the EDC is under development. But I do think there is a lot to be gained by that. And I, in my head, where everything I admit is perfect, I could see a site coordinator taking some time, finding the time to go through the EDC, because it would save them time later. But
Correct.
Being a little philosophical about queries, do we prioritize perfect data over meaningful data?
I think as an industry we do, but I do think meaningful data is more important than perfect data. Um, I know we want to get it clean and everything, but just interacting with participants who are real people, the data is not always clean. So again, as long as we have that audit trail giving that explanation, that clarification, and it makes sense, then the data is still valid.
And I think from what I've seen from the start of my career to here where I'm at now is the priority is meaningful data as we move into risk-based data management, risk-based monitoring. It's focusing on your primary and secondary endpoints. And I don't want to say let other things go, but maybe not even collect things that don't support those pieces, so that you're really just focused on that meaningful data to move your product or device or whatever you're working on forward.
Anything to add, Andrea?
Well, I would just say that, like I mentioned earlier, is that we start out with a project and we have this idea of what we're going to be collecting and what is going to be input into, the project, but we have to stay nimble and be willing to update and adjust. And when we make those adjustments, make sure that we're capturing that meaningful data. So we might not start out that way, and I can't speak for all projects, but in clinical trials, but I would say that the ones that I have been on adjust, as we see the trends come about and realize that, oh, well, this perfect data that we're going for is not realistic, not feasible. So we need to adjust and make sure that we are utilizing and collecting the meaningful data the best we can.
Yep.
We talked, some of this came up just organically in the conversation, but anything else you would add about how you think we can prevent more queries earlier in the study?
Again, training, communication. I also just taking feedback. So if we know that these automatic or system queries are misfiring or programmed incorrectly, being nimble and willing to adjust quickly. But then also, it's okay if the frequency and the robustness of queries happens on the front end, and then I would personally expect them to become less and less, just like what I expect protocol deviations to become less and less as we all adjust and gain experience and a better understanding of what is expected from the trial and how to manage and present the data.
And I think for me, just really focusing on what is the critical data that you need, and those should be where you are focusing your queries on. So, as an example, we are never going to not be querying on adverse event data. We are never not going to be querying on demography. But do we need queries on a physical exam when those are supposed to be reported as medical history or adverse events? If there's anything abnormal, do we need queries on them? Vital signs, we might need just the ones that are critical for the study. Do we need one on temperature when you're not in a vaccine study, as an example? Those are just examples I'm throwing out there that run around in my brain all the time. But, let's focus on what is really, really critical. And then, to Andrea's point, things may change in the middle. The company may have a conversation with the FDA, and now something that wasn't as critical before is now critical. So, there is that change, and the always evolving to be ready for your regulatory submissions. But yeah, focus on what's really meaningful and critical to the study.
And I agree with everything that's been said now and prior to. And just something on the site level, even if, say, you do your first screen and you see certain queries, just do a source update. Just get your source updated as soon as possible if you didn't have EDC available to you prior to the first screen, just because those are very simple, repeated mistakes that can happen if you're not physically looking at the data point at the time of the actual visit. So just making sure that your EDC and your source is actually matching up.
I love that because I never hear that. I never see anybody. But it's good to talk to the site, right? Because it's simple, but probably overlooked. If you could change one thing about the query process from your perspective, what would it be? Who's going first?
Really good question.
I'm going to jump in then. So for me, it would be, I would change what I hear on some of the message boards and Facebook and things like this, where people think that data management's only job is to write queries and that we actually get paid to buy the query. So we have some metric out there and we get X number of dollars. That is not true. Data management is not, it's not the best part of our job. Our best part of our job is, well, for me, is making sure that my deliverable to the next person down is going to support getting our drug or product to market. And so, queries aren't the favorite thing for me to do or my team to do, but we do it because it gets us along. So if we could just change that perception that data management is all about the queries. We're all about the data, bringing the data in and getting the data into a format that the next group functional area can use. That's my job.
I'd say this is very vague or generic, but I would like to change like the speed or the process. Kind of like how the comment that we got said, odds are it's not 5 days. There's always that like ideal versus the reality. But I would love if we could actually have that collaboration between the side, between data management, CRA, and vendors. Because at least for me, my queries that are outstanding are more likely vendor queries, just because those I feel are a lot more nuanced or they're written very hard to interpret, if that makes sense. So just having that availability, and I know it's not feasible just because we're all doing many things, we're all doing the best that we can, but just having that collaboration with those 3 to 5 people that you need to close out those queries as soon as possible.
That's a real issue though, and you are central to closing a database, so I feel that it's not too much of an ask for site to be represented in trying to work through those vendor queries and have access to the communication, because I've never been a data manager. I know that. But in my mind, I feel that it's electronic third-party data. The site had the visit. How can there be so much discrepancy? How can things fall out during reconciliation? But they always do.
But I don't know, Danielle, are you actually talking about reconciliation where the queries are coming from data management? Are you talking about the queries that are in these third-party vendor systems? So something like an ECG lab where they're querying directly to the site. Data management gets a report once a week. And that's the only time we know about the queries. We are not in the loop. The monitor's not in the loop for that.
I'm talking about cardiac safety, lab safety, those things like that. Because you guys aren't in the loop, I feel like it leaves it more prone to be outstanding longer.
Yeah. All it takes is one person changing at the site and those queries aren't going. They're not being addressed. Somebody forgets, you got to let the lab know that all the queries go to Danielle now instead of Andrea. And the queries are just sitting out there, just lingering.
Right. Yeah. So underscoring, I know nothing about data management. Thank you, Deb. But I think that's a really important, because that's something that can be worked on, though, in terms of there needs to be more visibility than just the coordinator and the vendor knowing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. To support and help. Andrea, did you answer? I can't remember.
I did not. I was thinking, I was like, oh, this is really good. 2 things. I would say to the point about the vendor queries, if there was some way to separate those out from the general queries, just to highlight, okay, I know in one database it separates out your task versus other people's tasks, and you can see who's responsible for what. And then the other thing is, I just feel like there's such an emotional component. There can be, not always. I think with experience, you just realize it just has to be done. But I have come up against sites who were coordinators who push back, who say, well, this is not my responsibility, or they try to shift the responsibility to somebody else, or because it's a lot of frustration, if we could just remove the emotional component of it and just realize, okay, this just has to be done. It's nothing personal. And I think, I know for me, when I first started out, sometimes I would take things personal. Like, oh my gosh, all these queries, I must have done something wrong. Oh my gosh, this protocol deviation, I must have done something wrong. It's not saying you have done something wrong. It's just, this is where we are in the process of this clinical trial. And we've noticed something. It may not just be your side. It could be trial wide. It could be something that we need to modify in the protocol, or it needs to be something we need to modify in the completion guidelines. So if we could remove the emotional component, that'd be great.
And Andrea, as someone who is fairly new to this industry, I'm 5 years in, that is a lesson that I had to learn really quickly. And once you take away that personal aspect from it, it's much quicker to resolve your work.
Right. It's like you think you've built up this, oh my gosh, this is like so many queries. And really you sit down and you have 15, 20 minutes uninterrupted and it's gone. And so you're like, oh my gosh, why was I freaking out over this? And it really just took me 15, 20 minutes.
Correct. And like any coordinators or like anyone at the site level, it is really a collaborative process. You're not in trouble. It's no one's pointing a finger. We're a team. We're all a team.
Yeah, my mentor has been talking about always looking at things and saying assume positive intent, and I really have taken that to heart lately. It's just the work. It's nobody's pointing fingers. It's just
And I mean, I think Danielle, you said it earlier, it's patient data. These are humans and it is what it is. And it's very easy to write down on a piece of paper what a perfect patient will look like. That perfect patient is not in your clinical trial and will never be in your clinical trial. And so people have questions like, is this really what happened? Yep. Okay, fine. Move on. If you wanted to give a message to your functional team, your functional area, on how to do better with queries tomorrow, what would you tell them?
I would say action is better than no action. Even if you don't know where to start when it comes to queries, reaching out and contacting your CRA, or even just like starting with your site level management, just something like that to get it moving. Because again, if we're going back into that kind of like freeze mentality when you see all of those queries, they're just going to still be sitting and still be outstanding, and the days are going to keep adding. So just getting started on that as soon as possible.
I would say just make sure that you set aside some time. I would say, ideally it would be weekly to resolve your queries across your different projects or different trials. Maybe it's bi-weekly. And if you have the opportunity to, just have a set schedule. Like I mentioned, it's very rare that, between your meetings and your patients, you're going to have a large amount of time, a large block of time. But if you can work in bursts, I think, the query resolution will go much quicker. And so it doesn't have to be resolved in one moment. You just have to work at it little by little.
And for me, I think it's the communication that we've talked about throughout this session, is just making sure that we are communicating. It's not just sitting in our silos doing our work. We don't want to do that. It's working together as a team to bring this trial, this device, product, drug to market is where we're all shooting for. So we want to be able to work together.
Yeah, and all of you gave a spin on just how can it get moving again, right? How can we keep it moving? How can we get it moving? And all of your compatriots on the other, in DM or CRA or site or stats, they all want to help keep it moving. So I think sometimes just asking the question if you don't know what to do to get it going. Thank you all for participating. I love this. I learned a lot actually today, especially from the site perspective. So thank you all for watching, and thank you to my panelists for your insight and experience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Great, take care.